Reformers and Their Stepchildren, Chapter 1, Donatistan, Part 2. There is every reason to believe that the Reformers were quite aware of the ancient battle. How could it be otherwise? It may safely be said that a person could not spend the span of a human life anywhere in Europe without coming in contact personally with the heretic. There were inquisitors everywhere. Some of these had a record of consigning men to the flames at the rate of almost one a day. How could an informed person remain unaffected by the tradition of the heretic? Moreover, there is every reason to believe that the Reformers were at the first sympathetic toward much of the old heritage of the heretic. They said things that cheered the hearts of people who had been conditioned by it. Sometimes they said things that were definitely in the idiom of the old protest. For a while it seemed, at least to onlookers who wanted to see it that way, that the Reformers were going to be the answer to the prayers of the heretics. When the Reformers presently gave evidence, as give it they did, that they were not intent on sweeping the Constantinian heritage away, there was an arching of the eyebrows among some who were walking with them. When the Reformers accepted the proffered arm of the civil rulers, as accept it they did, then there were frowns which soon changed into audible groans of disillusionment. And then there was the exodus, and with that the stepchildren were on the scene, and the second front. What caused the exodus was the Reformers' drift toward Neo-Constantinianism. As the stepchildren saw things, history was repeating itself. A new Christian sacralism was taking shape, on a smaller scale to be sure, and with some version of a reformed faith in the saddle. It was this new Christian sacralism that precipitated the Neo-Donatists. Small wonder they were called by that name. The parallel between these things that had happened in and with the coming of the Constantinian change and that which was happening now was indeed close, so close as to be uncanny. Just as his rounds with the original Donatists had made of Augustine the unrestrained sacralist that he became, so did the Reformers, in their rounds with the Neo-Donatists, become the uninhibited supporters of Neo-Constantinianism that the record shows them to have been. The parallel can be drawn closer still. Just as the original Donatism had its lunatic fringe, in the so-called Circumcellions, so did the later Donatism have its lunatic fringe in the men of Munster. Just as Augustine's experience with the Donatists led him to make certain retractions, in which he controverted his own earlier affirmations, so did their dealings with the Neo-Donatists cause the Reformers to repudiate some of the things they stood for earlier, so writing their own retractions, as it were. In its proper place, we shall return to this about-face of the Reformers, a matter to which the stepchildren were not slow to call attention. Just as the erstwhile Donatists had insisted that the independence of the Church with respect to the emperor must be upheld, so did the later Donatists insist that a true church cannot exist where the secular rule and the Christian church are blended together. It runs like a refrain through the testimony of the stepchildren that as they saw it, the Reformation had gone sour when the Reformers had made a league with the civil powers. It has therefore been very well said that the crystallization of the Reformation in territorial churches or in parishes led by city political authorities gave the impulse for the development of the Second Front. A good start had been made, so said the stepchildren, but the enlistment of the magistrates had spoiled it all. One of the manifestos that issued from the Second Front says, after relating a great deal of older history of the heretic, in 1519, Martin Luther began to write against the frightful abominations of the Babylonian harlot, and to disclose all her wickedness, yes, as with thunderclaps to bring it all down. But as soon as he joined himself to the secular rule, seeking protection there against the cross, then it went with him as with a man who in mending an old kettle only makes the hole bigger, and he raised up a people altogether callous in sin. The charge, lodged with many variations, was that the Reformers had begun well, but had spoiled their beginning when they reverted back to the medieval pattern of things. The Reformers, said the stepchildren, had fallen back to the beast, that is, the Romish school, which now they defend. The kingdom of God, which had previously come to them, they had again cast away. Now there were two papal systems, an old one and a new, both of them opposed to the stepchildren, and for the same reason, namely, the latter's rejection of Christian sacralism. There's a footnote that says, an incarcerated soldier of the Second Front spoke of his opponents, whether from the papal camp or the Protestant camp, as Bepsler. Oh, I'm sorry. That's that's just a phrase in another language. No idea. Doesn't even look like a familiar language to me. I'm guessing maybe something near German. Okay, moving on. It was the coalition of the reformers with the arm of flesh that grieved those who came to be treated as stepchildren. One by one, modern investigators have come to see this. Quote, they would have nothing to do with the state church, and this was the main point in their separation from the Lutherans, Zwinglians, and Calvinists. This was the one conception on which all parties among them were in absolute accord. The real issue was on the question of the type of church which should take the place of the old church. The real issue was a bitter and irreconcilable battle between two mutually exclusive concepts of the church. Luther stopped short of a full reformation, content to walk hand in hand with the state, bogged down halfway between Catholicism and the New Testament church organization. So runs the consensus. While the radicals were defecting from Luther, the Swiss reformer Zwingli was having similar troubles. At the outset, Zwingli had been intimate with the people who later opened the Second Front. He had, in fact, to quite an extent shared their views, a fact to which the stepchildren were not slow to point. He had, for example, said that infant baptism, nit sen sol, ought not to be. Then came the moment in which the city council let it be known that all contemplated reforms in the religious area had to be officially approved by them first. To this Zwingli submitted, and it was at this moment, very precisely, that the radicals began to peel off. One of the first mutterings of the storm that was brewing was the remark made by one who would soon function as a leader among the stepchildren. Quote, you have no business giving these decisions into the hands of the civil power. This marked not only the beginning of the tension, it also pinpointed the conceptual area in which it occurred, namely, that of the nature of the church and the relationship in which it stands to society as such. Again, it was the question that had been in the minds of the Donatists, the same insistence that the independence of the church in regard to the magistrate must be preserved at all costs. Just as in the eyes of the Donatists, the church had disgraced itself when it accepted the flirtations of the emperor, so did the Neo-Donatists frown upon the reformers for letting themselves be seduced by the same siren voice, the same flirtations. The flirtations to which we refer ended in a marriage. It was this marriage that put in the status of stepchildren those who had hitherto walked with the reformers, but who had resisted stubbornly the coalescence of church and state. Whether the marriage was one of convenience, we shall not attempt to say. That it was diplomatically wise is of course evident. It made it possible for the reform, which would otherwise in all likelihood have been choked in its own blood and dispatched as the Hussite reform had been dispatched, to have a future. By it, the ancient sacralist system, armed to the teeth with military might, available to it on a moment's notice, was challenged by a rival sacralist system, likewise backed up by a sword of steel. But from a principial point of view, the marriage was a catastrophe, for it made inevitable the perpetuation of all the evils that had been spawned by the Constantinian change. As one of the first to attempt an objective study of the Second Front, C.A. Cornelius has put it, as correct as this step taken by Zwingli was from the point of view of the state, and however much it was calculated to give his ecclesiastical endeavors greater dignity and status, it was a bad step from an evangelical point of view, one that was certain to lead to contention and schism in the party. And there's a footnote. Alfred Farner in his, and then it's in German, traces Zwingli. traces Zwingli's gradual change from an ambiguous position to an outright espousal of Christian sacralism. He sees Zwingli going past dead center in his letter to Blarer, Blarer, in which Farner says, "It becomes clear," and then he writes in German and doesn't translate it. So, something to the effect that he approves of Christian sacralism as long as it's his Christian sacralism, according to the Reformers' doctrine. Of the momentous development, the marriage of which we have spoken, a present-day student of Reformation history has said so very correctly, "The product of the development from October 1523 to January 1525 was the rejection of Corpus Christianum. Following the revolutionary change in the relations of the Church and the world which we associate with the names of Constantine, Theodosius, Augustine, medieval Christendom had no room for the biblical concept of the world. The consequences for ethics, for a doctrine of the Church, for evangelism, and for eschatology were revolutionary and yet hardly noticed. So conscious and so all-pervading was the acceptance of the identity of Church and society that the Reformers, each working closely with the local magistracy and seeking to reform medieval Catholicism with as little commotion as possible, were not even aware of a problem and were able to pass off as political revolutionaries those who raised the question." In the eyes of the Donatists, whether early Donatists or late, the Church had, quote, fallen in the days of Constantine, with a fall as calamitous and as fraught with evil consequences as the fall in Eden. This fall had made a fallen creature of the Church, one dead in trespasses and sins. And just as the catastrophe in Eden had made a rebirth necessary, so did the fall of the 4th century require a new creation. So said the heretics. They felt called, therefore, to reconstitute the Church, to start all over. The medieval heretics may therefore be called restitutionists, and their views, restitutionism. Because the stepchildren fell heir to this assessment of the Constantinian change, they may likewise be called restitutionists. We shall do so, and so fulfill a promise made in the introduction of this volume. They were doubly entitled to this term, for as they saw things, they were confronted with a twice fallen Church, once in the days of Constantine, and now again in the days of the Reform. Restitutionists sought to recover the Church of the New Testament. Their ambition, early and late, was to return the Church of Christ to its New Testament format. This ambition comes to expression constantly in the literature which the stepchildren have left behind. We read, for instance, in an account drawn up by a man who fought at the Second Front. At the outset, it must be confessed and granted that the first Church of Christ and the Apostles has in foregoing times been destroyed and laid waste by Antichrist, so that we do not need to waste many words or call in many witnesses, seeing that we to a man do know, as do all who call themselves evangelicals, that the entire papacy has become a Sodom. He then goes on to describe the steps with which the restitutionists took in an effort to recover the erstwhile Church. Since the Reformers, as the restitutionists saw things, were now just as fallen as the Papists, their reformatory program held forth no promise. Let us not pass lightly over the implications of the Constantinian change. A fall is the serious thing. The change that took place in the days of Constantine shook the ship from stem to stem. Nothing in the Church's theology, its organization, its place in the world, escaped the effects of the virus that had entered its bloodstream. Medication would have to be strong and in large doses. Moreover, let it be remembered that the Church, which the men of the 16th century had inherited, had borne the image of the Constantinian synthesis for well over a millennium when the Reformation began to happen. Hence, let no one underestimate the headlong daring of the radicals of the Reformation times. They were out to turn the world upside down, the world as it had stood for so long a time that men could hardly imagine it had ever stood otherwise. Had it not been for the fact that the blueprints of the authentic Church were still accessible in the New Testament, there would never have been any clamor for the restitution of it. We shall spend the rest of our space in this chapter, and all of our space in the chapters that follow, setting forth somewhat the effects of the fall of the Church. This will simultaneously get us acquainted with the stepchildren and their ambitions. We shall travel from one sector of the Second Front to the other to see what goes on. As we do so, we will probably have the same experience which a modern historian, Walter Hobhouse, had when he traveled this same path. And this is a longer quote from him. Long ago I came to believe that the great change in the relations between the Church and the world, which began with the conversion of Constantine, is not only a decisive turning point in Church history, but is also the key to many of the practical difficulties of the present day, and that the Church of the future is destined more and more to return to the condition of things somewhat like that which prevailed in the ante-Nicene Church. That is to say, that instead of pretending to be coextensive with the world, it will confess itself the church of a minority, will accept a position involving a more conscious antagonism with the world, and will, in return, gain in some measure its former coherence. When Constantine came into the church, he did not check his imperial equipment at the door. No, indeed, he came in with all the accoutrements that pertain to the secular regime. He was not just a Roman who had learned how to bow to the Christ. He had been Pontifex Maximus hitherto, and high priest of the Roman state religion, and he entered the church with the understanding that he would be Pontifex Maximus there too. And just as his sword had flashed in defense of the old religion, so now it would flash in defense of the new. This put a new and novel weapon in the hand of the bride of Christ, the sword of steel. Now her battles would be fought in the fashion to which the Roman legions were accustomed. The implication was that he who had come meek and lowly and riding upon a colt, the foal of an ass, would now come on a prancing war horse. Almost incredible though it is, men do not seem to have noticed how grotesque this was. Had it not been for the Roman precedent, the change would have been unthinkable. It is true, the grotesqueness of the new situation did, it seems, register to a degree with those who promoted the change, and it registered enough to make them try to file down the rough edges somewhat. They invented the ridiculous fiction that the Church did not really sacrifice her dignity when the emperor's sword flashed in her behalf, for it was the magistrate's man that actually drew the blood, even though it was at her behest. Out of the words of Peter recorded in Luke 22:23, "Lord, here are 2 swords," the Church distilled the ridiculous doctrine that Jesus intended his Church to have 2 swords, the sword of the Spirit, which the clergy wields, and the sword of steel, which the soldier swings. By the year 1150, this formula of the 2 swords was already old, so old as to be unquestioned. Quote, "2 swords belong to Peter. One is in his hand, the other is at his command whenever it is needful to draw it. Both the spiritual and the material sword belong to the Church. The latter sword is drawn for the Church, the former by the Church. One belongs to the priest and the other to the soldiery, but this one is drawn at the orders of the priest." By this colossal piece of sophistry, the Church made herself believe that she could order the lifeblood of men to be let, all the while getting none of it on her skirt. This monstrous doctrine was put forth in dead earnest all through medieval times. It is set forth in the Bull Unum Sanctum, issued by Boniface in 1302. It remains the unrepudiated doctrine of the Catholic Church to this day. As Thomas Aquinas has it, the state through which earthly objectives are reached must be subordinated to the Church. Church and state are 2 swords which God has given to Christendom for protection. Both these swords, however, are by him given to the Pope, and the temporal sword is then by the Pope entrusted to the rulers of state. The Constantinian change made short work of Jesus' words, "My kingdom is not of this world, else would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered." It put Peter in the right for drawing the sword to promote the cause, and it put Jesus in the wrong for rebuking Peter for it. The fallen church conveniently forgot that Jesus had been deeply displeased at the first suggestion of a second sword. It forgot that he had been so disturbed by Peter's rash act that he had stooped down to repair the damage Peter's sword had inflicted. It overlooked the fact that he had performed a miracle of healing, his last, to erase from the record the act so out of keeping with the work he came to do. The medieval church boasted of being in the signature of this Peter. Well, it was more like him than it knew. Nor was this doctrine of the two swords merely a piece of scholastic subtlety. It was said and meant in dead earnest, and practiced too. All through medieval times, the heads of heretics rolled in all directions, and the earth was dampened with the blood of men, the air abused with the smell of the roasting flesh of men, all in the signature of the Constantinian change. And at all times the priests stood by, to see to it that the secular power performed the gruesome assignment. In order to be able to live with herself, the Church regularly begged the executioner to stop short of life and limb, a request that neither she nor he ever took seriously. The Church would have been wholly embarrassed if anyone had taken this bit of window dressing seriously. Here's a footnote. The brutality and cruelty that accompanied the executions performed under the supervision of the, quote, fallen church were, and they mean that, by the way, seriously. They're saying that the stepchildren called the Catholic Church, as well as the reformers that agreed with them, the fallen church, were too frightful for words. We shall give, but leave untranslated, the public announcement that went with the execution of a certain stepchild named Michael. Again, they do it in German and don't translate it. And it says, it was considered one of the lesser punishments to have the tongue pierced, a stick of wood thrust through it, and so to stand in the public square for an hour or so. It is understandable that men who knew the Christ of the New Testament should begin to speak of the Church as fallen. To the credit of the heretics, it may be said that they never fell for this pious double talk, never let the Church proclaim with impunity the idea that because she did not actually draw the blood, she was not guilty of murder. The Waldensians said caustically, "The priests actuate the secular arm and then think to be free from murder, and they wish to be known as benefactors. Yes, just as did Annas and Caiaphas and the rest of the Pharisees in the time of Christ, so does innocent, capitalized innocent, do in our times. They refrained from going into the house of Pilate, lest they be defiled, and in the meantime delivered Jesus up to the secular arm." The horrible idea that the Church of Christ may move the wrist of the hand that holds the sword was, of course, carefully stated in the jurisprudence of the Middle Ages. None put it more succinctly than did a jurist of the early 16th century, Phillips Wyland, who taught that heresy is punished by the fire. The spiritual judge tries the case, and the secular judge performs the execution. Centuries earlier, the famous expert at law, Philip de Beaumanoir, had put it this way, a bit more lengthily. If a lay person believes incorrectly, he is to be returned to the true faith by instruction. If a lay person believes incorrectly, he is to be returned to the true faith by instruction. If he refuses to believe, but adheres instead to his wicked error, then he shall be condemned as a heretic and burned. But in that event, lay justice must come to the aid of the Holy Church. For when anyone is condemned as a heretic by the examinations conducted by the Holy Church, then the Holy Church must leave him to lay justice, and the lay justice must then burn him, seeing that the spiritual justice ought not to put anyone to death. Oh my. Here's two footnotes. One says, the custom of executing heretics by fire rather than by some other means seems to have come up in connection with John 15:6, which says, if a man abide not in me, which was identified with not staying in the church, that's in parentheses there, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. The second footnote says, in the original, this passage, to which we shall return, runs as follows. And then there is a long quote in another language. I think it's in French. Yep, it's in French. Sorry, can't read that to you. Such then was Christendom. The fall of the Church had so changed the visage of the bride of Christ as to make her unrecognizable. She who had been sent on a mission of healing and helping had taken on the features of the modern police state. We make this comparison deliberately and seriously. The modern totalitarian state has added nothing new, not even that which we now call brainwashing. The medieval world was a world in which minorities were unwanted. It was a world in which the rights of speech and of assembly were, as we shall have occasion to see in a later chapter, rigidly curtailed. Medieval society was optionless society, as optionless as any totalitarianism in our times. A small number of, quote, party members ran the entire show. The common man was completely and effectively defranchised. The parallel is frightening, as is the thought that in areas where the medieval monolithic society has not been successfully challenged, the one totalitarianism readily makes way for the other. The one encouraging fact is that there was at all times, all through the Middle Ages, a sustained protest against the distortions that had come with the Constantinian change, and that this sustained protest finally and ultimately was able to blow apart the Constantinian colossus. In and with this protest, the New Testament and its delineation of the Christian Church remained a part of the heritage of man. To this the stepchildren fell heir. Among them we find the ambition of the medieval heretic restated, to recover the Church of pre-Constantinian times. Among the stepchildren we find, therefore, from the beginning, a studied attempt to expel the sword of steel from the affairs of the Church, an attempt to return the sword of the magistrate to its proper place. Among them we hear such cries as these: "All they have eternal punishment awaiting them who seek to sustain the kingdom of God with recourse to the secular arm." Also, in my opinion, the rulers and their clergymen assign more to the magistrate than they should, for it is not the prerogative of any magistrate to sustain the word of God by force, seeing that it is free. Such, then, was the ideology to which the stepchildren rallied. We shall have occasion to see that the attempt to recover Paradise Lost lay at the heart of the program that made the second front necessary, and that every feature of the vision of the stepchildren was but a working out of this central thrust. It was the stepchildren's evaluation of the Constantinian change that stood between them and the reformers, this in essence, this particularly. For the reformers were not minded to repudiate the Constantinian change. Their ambition was not to get rid of Christian sacralism. Rather was it their ambition to overlay the Christian sacralism that was partial to Catholicism with a Christian sacralism that was partial to Protestantism. The record is entirely plain in this matter, as we shall discover in some detail in the course of these pages. Suffice it to say at this juncture that a Reformed minister was deposed in 16th century Strasbourg for adhering to a new and Anabaptist error, which consisted in this: that the magistrate must leave every man to his own devices in regard to religion, no matter what he believes or teaches, so long as he does not disturb the outward civil quiet. And there's it's in another language, never mind. Can't read the next footnote. The record shows very plainly that a frightful failure to understand the stepchildren developed. We must by all means point this out, for unless we see through this misunderstanding, this failure to understand each other, we cannot hope to understand the reformers' treatment of their stepchildren. Unless we see through this misunderstanding, we will be looking in the wrong place for the cause of the dissension. And this in turn will lead us to offer another, an erroneous, explanation. We must therefore look closely at the record touching this matter. In the interrogations to which the stepchildren were exposed, usually in prison, we constantly encounter the question: should there be a magistrate, and should he sustain the word of God? It is plain that for the questioner this is one question, but for the one questioned this was two questions. For the questioner, a simple yes and a plain no were the alternatives. For the answerer, it was a matter of yes and no. Yes to the question whether there should be such a thing as civil ruler, and no to the question whether it is his assignment to sustain the word of God. For the questioner, a negative answer to the question whether the magistrate has the duty to sustain the word of God with his sword was tantamount to a statement that there should be no magistrate. We who have lived for so long in a climate in which church and state are separate institutions will have difficulty understanding how this misunderstanding could come about and persist so. But it did come about, and this is one of the darkest features of a dismal story. Let us explore the matter further. For the man who stands in the Constantinian tradition, the things we call church and state are essentially a single entity, the warp and the woof of a single fabric. The parish is in the tradition of Constantinianism at one and the same time a religious and a political unit. Something of this usage survives in some of the southern states, where what we call counties are still referred to as parishes, the word having sloughed off its ecclesiastical connotation. This is a Dutch word, Gemeente, gemeente, is in the Dutch tradition of Constantinianism at one and the same time a religious or ecclesiastical entity and a socio-political one. This usage survives in the Netherlands to this day, where one never knows what gemeente stands for, one or the other. This fact will go far to explain the otherwise astounding fact that when the stepchildren said that the sword had to quit the church, their opponents thought that they heard them say that the sword has no proper place in human society. When the stepchildren said that the idea of a sword in the affairs of the church is an anomaly, the reformers thought they had heard them say that the sword has no rightful place in the community. As far as we have been able to make out, no one in the Second Front ever advocated the elimination of the civil power from the society of men. They did in some cases tend to say that capital punishment was wrong, a matter in which many would in our day concur. But that is not the same as to deny the sword function. However, as far as we have been able to discern, every last man among the stepchildren stood for the expulsion of the sword function from the affairs of religion. It was because their foes were unable in their thinking to combine these two positions that the legend was born that the stepchildren advocated the overthrow of the civil rule, a legend that finds its classic expression in Article 36 of the Belgic Confession, to the unending embarrassment of those churches that adhere to this confession. One can understand this failure to communicate if he will for the moment divest himself of the terminology of, quote, church and, quote, state, and then attempt to discuss the matter. Without these terms, or others of like value, it is indeed difficult to distinguish between the clamor for the cessation of the sword function in things of the faith and a clamor for its cessation, überhaupt. I don't know what that means. Luther fell into the misunderstanding of which we are speaking. Mindful of the fact that the ancient Donatists had resisted the invasion of the civil power into the affairs of the church, he ascribed to them the same nihilism that men thought to detect in the stepchildren. He wrote, "The Donatists condemned the secular rule which we must now allow to remain." In this Luther was, of course, in error historically, for there is no evidence that the original Donatists condemned the secular rule. There is no hint of anti-imperial ambition among them, no nihilism. How then came Luther to blunder so in the matter of history? The answer is that for 12 centuries the story had been around that he who challenges Christian sacralism challenges government as such. The Donatists had challenged emerging Christian sacralism. Hence the Donatists had been political nihilists. This was spurious logic on Luther's part, as spurious as was the logic that laid the same charge at this doorstep of the stepchildren. The charge was, and is, false. When the reformers asserted that the people of the Second Front seek to overthrow government, they did them a gross injustice. Perhaps the following is enough for the space of this chapter to prove that the stepchildren were not nihilists. A Protestant minister named Tileman Noll, N-O-L-L, stole away one night to visit a conventicle of the stepchildren, primarily, so he said, to have first-hand knowledge as to what went on there. He was subsequently taken in hand by a church court and made to confess in public his grave sin. At that, it almost cost him his cloth. What displeased his superiors especially was that on the Sunday after his visit to the nocturnal gathering of the, quote, heretics, he had told his own parishioners that he had discovered that he had thus far preached nothing but the cold letter of the Scripture. Part of his sentence was, and this throws an interesting light upon the matter that will engage us in a subsequent chapter, the latitudinarianism concerning conduct that marked the camp of the Reform, that he, quote, shall keep himself apart from all gay parties and drinking sprees for a whole year, upon pain of losing his ministerial status. Upon Pastor Knoll's return from the conventicle, he testified that of all that had transpired at the conventicle, quote, "The prayer pleased me the most, for they prayed for the needs of all Christendom, also for the emperor, the king, the nobles and princes, that God might give them wisdom. It would appear that people who pray in that vein are not addicted to anything resembling an ambition to overthrow the government. To charge them with this nevertheless was a gross injustice. It was an accusation born not out of observation, but out of the thought habits of an ancient sacralism." The reformers, we have said, were not ready to dismiss the sword of the magistrate from the affairs of religion. They justified to the hilt the idea that the sword of the civil ruler must throw the heretic in line and keep him there. We need only to quote from the writings of Urbanus Regius, Luther's trusted associate, in support of this. He said, "When heresy breaks forth, then the magistrate must punish not with less but with greater vigor than is employed against other evildoers, robbers, murderers, thieves, and the like." The stance of the reformers is plain enough from the following quotation, also from the pen of Regius. "God raises up the magistracy against heretics, faction makers, and schismatics in the Christian church in order that Hagar may be flogged by Sarah." This allegory Regius had borrowed from the writings of Augustine, to which we shall return in a later chapter. "The Donatists murder men's souls, make them go to eternal death, and then they complain when men punish them with temporal death. Therefore a Christian magistrate must make it his first concern to keep the Christian religion pure. All who know history will know what has been done in this matter by such men as Constantine, Marianus, Theodosius, Charlemagne, and others. We dare say that no Protestant, at least no Protestant in the New World, will be able to be at peace with the position set forth in these quotations. And yet, are they typical of the Reformers, who one and all refused to endorse the Stepchildren's contention that the sword is out of bounds when it invades the area of religious faith? Since this study is published under the auspices of a foundation that calls itself by the name of one of the major reformers, John Calvin, it will be in place to take a close look at his thinking in regard to the matter at hand. We shall test him at 2 points, the Servetus episode and his reaction to the Stepchildren's first doctrinal manifesto, promulgated at Schlatten on Rand, also known as Schleitheim, in the year 1527. Although Servetus was not typical of the Stepchildren as such, his case does throw a great deal of light upon the mind of John Calvin in regard to the matter we are discussing. For that reason, this material deserves a place in this study, the more so since the thinking that led to the burning of Servetus was of a piece with the thinking that made the life of the Stepchildren so hard. The burning of Servetus, let it be said with utmost clarity, was a deed for which Calvin must be held largely responsible. It was not done in spite of Calvin, as some over-ardent admirers of his are wont to say. He planned it beforehand and maneuvered it from start to finish. It occurred because of him and not in spite of him. After it had taken place, Calvin defended it with every possible and impossible argument. There is every reason to believe that if it had not been for the fact that public opinion was beginning to run against this kind of thing, there would have been many more such burnings. The event was the direct result of the sacralism to which Calvin remained committed, a sacralism which he never discarded. In Calvin's defense, it might be said, and not without some justification, that since he arrived on the scene somewhat late, after the first decade, after the Neo-Constantinianism into which the Reformation drifted and developed, he really didn't have much choice in the matter. The die was already cast when he appeared on the scene. The second front had already been opened. Calvin never was in the position in which Luther and Zwingli had been, in those early days when the heirs of medieval restitutionism were still looking on hopefully. When Calvin entered upon his life's task, the Reformation had already lost those who had been conditioned by the medieval rebellion against Christian sacralism. If it was too radical for Luther to go the way of restitutionism, it was much too radical for Calvin, who came a bit later. If it was too much to expect Luther to pry himself loose from 12 centuries of history, it was much too much for Calvin to come clear of 12 centuries plus a very important decade. Be that as it may, the Servetus execution took place in a sacralist setting and was the result of sacralist thinking. It was medieval to the core. It reveals a Constantinian determination. Here was a man who posed no threat to civil serenity in Geneva, unless of course it be granted that anyone who deviates from the orthodoxy espoused by the state is ipso facto a threat to that civil serenity. Servetus started no parades, made no speeches, carried no placards, had no political ambitions. He did have some erratic ideas touching the doctrine of the Trinity, and he entertained some deviating notions concerning baptism, especially infant baptism. No doubt there was something of the spiritual iconoclast in him, as there is in all men of genius. Servetus was something of a scientific genius in that he anticipated the idea of the circulatory course of the blood. But he was not a revolutionary in the political sense. He was indeed, quote, off the beam in matters of religious doctrine, but he did not deserve to be arrested or executed, a judgment in which the man of sacralist convictions cannot, of course, concur. Only in a sacralist climate would men deal in such a way with such a man. The footnote says, in the sacral pattern, heresy is automatically sedition. The codes of Justinian decreed that, quote, heresy shall be construed to be an offense against the civil order. It was this dogmatism that led to the burning of Servetus. It has been said that Calvin sought, late in the trial, to have sentence commuted to the effect that some mode of execution other than by fire would be Servetus's lot. The reason for this suggestion was that Calvin wanted Servetus eliminated as an offender against the civil order. Death by fire was for offenders in the area of religion. Hence Calvin's concern in the matter. It was this same sensitivity that made Margaret of Parma, in 1567, specify death by hanging for Guido de Bray. It would look better to have de Bray destroyed as a seditionist than as a heretic. Hence death by the noose rather than by the flame. So also in the case of Servetus. If the very burning of the unhappy Spaniard proves that Calvin's Geneva was a sacral state, and Geneva's Calvin a sacralist thinker, the literature that sprang up in defense of the awful deed makes it doubly clear. When the news was out that Servetus had died in the fire, a cry of outrage resounded over most of Europe. It is true that many of the leaders of the Reform applauded the burning. Melanchthon, for example, wrote that, the Church owes and always will owe a debt of gratitude to you for having put the heretic to death. Although it is also true that some, even in Geneva itself, refused to put their names to a document supporting the execution. But there was a chorus of protest that issued at once from those circles that had been deeply influenced by the humanizing tendencies of the times. Contrary to the legend that is kept alive by over-ardent admirers of Calvin, the spirit of the age was already relegating such inhumanity to the limbo of the past. The Renaissance had not been without its fruitage of toleration. There is reason to believe that Calvin and those about him who had engineered the Servetus killing had a vague foreboding that the news of the awful incident would cost them plenty. They seem to have been on the defensive from the moment the ashes of the fire had cooled. They began to work furiously on a book which was supposed to calm the spirits and prevent a too great exodus. Early in 1554, a matter of months after Servetus had expired, he had died on October 27, 1553, a defense, the full title was Defensio Orthodoxae Fidei de Sacra Trinitate, I don't know how to say it, but I'm guessing that means a defense of the Orthodox faith of sacral, the Holy Trinity? Just guessing. Rolled from the presses of Oliva Roberti Stefani. If Calvin and his colleagues had expected this publication to serve as oil on the troubled waters, they were in for an unpleasant surprise, for its impact was more like oil on a fire. Almost at once, it was in early March, a scathing denunciation of the burning, as well as of the whole line of reasoning that had produced it, came from an unnamed press. It was published anonymously, moreover. Such were the times that it was not safe to put one's name to a publication of that import. With the title, and that's definitely a title in another language that I cannot pronounce. And it does say that it means whether heretics are to be liquidated. The Genevans were of course unwilling to let this be the last word, and so in early August they came out with a second publication, bearing the title, and another one, Whether Heretics Should Be Punished by the Civil Ruler, against Martin Bellius, who, they suspected, was the author of the anonymous publication against which they were reacting.